A picture-perfect family, a devoted father, a loving mother, 3 beautiful children, and a dream home in Disney's idyllic town of Celebration, Florida. On the outside, the Todts were everything a family was supposed to be, but behind closed doors, Anthony Todt was drowning in debt, tangled in fraud, and hiding secrets that no one saw coming. Then, in January 2020, when federal agents arrived at the Todt home to serve an arrest warrant, they made a stomach-churning discovery. Inside, Anthony Todt was calmly living among the decomposing bodies of his wife and 3 children, his entire family wiped out. The story that unfolded next would be one of the most disturbing family annihilation cases in recent history. If family betrayal and twisted true crime stories captivate you, subscribe now so you never miss another case that delves into the darkest corners of human nature. On January 13, 2020, federal agents and Osceola County deputies arrived at the Todt family home in Celebration, Florida. Their mission was to arrest Anthony Todt on charges of healthcare fraud, but what they found inside would turn an ordinary warrant execution into one of the most gruesome crime scenes in recent history. When they knocked on the door, there was no response. However, they had a key, obtained from the landlord. As they stepped inside, an overwhelming stench filled the air. The putrid smell of decay was impossible to ignore. Anthony Todt suddenly appeared at the top of the staircase, disoriented and barely able to stand. He mumbled something incoherent, his body swaying as if he were about to collapse. Officers noticed his strange, sluggish movements and the way his hands trembled. He had taken a large amount of Benadryl, a failed suicide attempt. But the true horror awaited in the bedrooms. One by one, the bodies of Megan Todt, Alec, Tyler, and little Zoe were found in their beds, covered in blankets. Their small hands clutched crucifixes. Their bodies were badly decomposed, indicating that they had been dead for several weeks. Nearby, officers discovered the body of Breezy, the family dog, lying lifeless in her bed. The crime scene was disturbing beyond words. Zoe, the youngest, was in such a severe state of decomposition that officers initially did not see her. Her tiny body had been crushed beneath her mother's feet. Anthony Todt was immediately taken into custody. He was barely conscious and admitted to consuming pills in an attempt to end his own life. But nothing could prepare investigators for what he was about to tell them next. Beneath the surface of the seemingly perfect Todt family was a financial house of cards on the verge of collapse. For years, Anthony Todt had been leading a double life, desperately trying to keep his family in the dark about the impending disaster. His physical therapy practice in Connecticut had been thriving, at least on paper, but behind closed doors, he was drowning in fraud, debt, and lawsuits. In April 2019, federal investigators discovered that Anthony was fraudulently billing Medicaid and private insurance companies for treatments that never happened. He was overcharging for visits, filing claims for non-existent therapy sessions, and pocketing the money. The scam had gone unnoticed for years, but investigators eventually caught on, launching a full-scale probe into his clinic. By the end of 2019, authorities had enough evidence to charge him. A federal warrant was issued for his arrest, but that wasn't the only financial disaster looming over him. Anthony had also been borrowing money from high-interest lenders, digging himself into a financial grave he couldn't escape. Lawsuits started piling up. His debts had soared over $100,000, and the family was facing an imminent eviction from their dream home in Celebration, Florida. Yet, Megan and the children had no idea. Anthony had carefully hidden his financial troubles from them. He continued to make Disney trips with the kids, pretending everything was fine, while secretly trying to delay the inevitable. By December, Anthony Todt knew his life was over. He was going to lose everything: his business, his home, and his freedom. Rather than face the consequences, he hatched an unthinkable plan. Instead of telling Megan the truth, He decided the entire family needed to die. He would kill them all, then take his own life, ensuring that they could cross over together, rather than endure the shame and fallout of his financial collapse. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a premeditated execution of the people who trusted him the most. The family home in Celebration, Florida, had once been a place of warmth and laughter, but in the final days of December, it became the setting of an unspeakable tragedy. Anthony first drugged his children and his wife, crushing Benadryl into their food to render them unconscious. They trusted him completely, never suspecting that their father, the man who had tucked them in at night, was preparing to end their lives. Megan Todt, the woman who had built her life around her children, was the first to die. Anthony later claimed she had taken her own life, but evidence painted a different story. She had been smothered. Alec, 13, and Tyler, 11, were next. Both were stabbed in the stomach and suffocated. Zoe, the youngest at just 4 years old, was smothered beneath her mother's body. She was so small that when investigators arrived, they didn't even realize her body was there at first. Even the family dog, Breezy, wasn't spared. Anthony strangled the dog, ensuring that nothing from their life would be left behind. After the murders, Anthony stayed in the house with their decomposing bodies for weeks. He lived among the corpses of his family, sleeping next to them, eating in the same house, acting as if nothing had happened. Neighbors noticed something was off. The once lively home had gone eerily quiet. Mail piled up at the door. The family's social media went silent, but no one suspected the horror unfolding inside. At first, Anthony played the grieving husband and father, telling detectives that Megan had killed their children and then turned the knife on herself. "She couldn't handle life anymore," he said in a monotone voice. She did it. I couldn't stop her." But detectives weren't buying it. Megan had no history of violence, no record of harming her children, and no defensive wounds that would suggest a struggle. The lack of forced entry ruled out an intruder. Even more damning, the autopsy revealed multiple stab wounds and evidence of smothering, suggesting a methodical, controlled execution rather than a spontaneous act of despair. The investigators pressed harder. Anthony's second story, a murder pact for the apocalypse. Under intense questioning, Anthony Todt's story shifted. This time he admitted to killing his children, but insisted that it had been a family suicide pact. "The world was ending," he claimed. "We wanted to be together in the afterlife." He rambled about doomsday prophecies, spiritual awakenings, and a promise to reunite with his family in heaven. He described how they had taken Benadryl to make it easier, how he had smothered them one by one, and how Megan had willingly participated, a claim strongly refuted by the evidence. Detectives saw through the lies. This wasn't a mutual decision. This was a massacre, and Anthony Todt was the executioner. As authorities dug deeper into Todt's life, the motive became clearer. He was drowning in debt, owing over $100,000 to creditors. His physical therapy business in Connecticut was collapsing under a federal fraud investigation. His wife and kids had no idea about his legal troubles until it was too late. The theory? Anthony Todt saw no way out. He chose to eliminate his family rather than face the shame of financial ruin and prison. But instead of taking his own life, he lingered for weeks in the house, living among the corpses of the people who once loved him. By the time Anthony Todt faced trial in April 2022, the public had already made up their minds. He was the cold-blooded killer who wiped out his family, and his contradictory statements only solidified his guilt. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a clear picture. Anthony Todt was drowning in debt. His fraudulent medical business was collapsing. He saw no way out. Instead of facing his failures, he decided to eliminate his family to avoid humiliation. He lived for weeks with their decaying bodies, sending fake text messages to relatives to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. He killed the family dog, Breezy, because even the pet couldn't be spared from his twisted plan. As horrific crime scene photos were shown to the jury, the room fell into a stunned silence. The images of Megan and her children lying lifeless, crucifixes gripped in their tiny hands, smothered and stabbed, sent a wave of nausea through the courtroom. Anthony Todt pleaded not guilty, spinning yet another version of events. This time he claimed Megan was responsible for the murders. He insisted he had no recollection of what had happened. He accused the police of coercing him into confessing, but the evidence was overwhelming. The autopsy report showed multiple stab wounds and signs of smothering, proving the deaths were not suicides. Anthony's DNA was on the murder weapon, the knife used in the killings. He stayed in the house with the bodies for weeks, using their credit cards to order food and survive. There was no plausible explanation other than guilt. After just a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a swift and unanimous decision. Guilty on all counts. Anthony Todt showed no emotion as the verdict was read. No remorse, no tears. You are a man without a conscience, without a soul. You robbed your children of their futures, your wife of her life, and your family of peace. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional year for the brutal killing of the family dog. For the first time in his life, Anthony Todt had lost control. The sentencing of Anthony Todt might have brought legal closure, but the emotional wreckage left behind was beyond repair. Entire generations were wiped out in a single act of betrayal. Celebration, Florida, a town built on the Disney dream, had become the backdrop of a horrific nightmare. The house where the Todt family once lived stood empty, a chilling reminder of the horrors that unfolded behind closed doors. Neighbors, once accustomed to the cheerful faces of Alec, Tyler, and little Zoe, now couldn't bear to look at the home. Many in the community struggled to understand how a father, once perceived as a doting dad, could execute such a monstrous act. For Megan's side of the family, the pain was unimaginable. Her parents lost their daughter and all 3 grandchildren in one night. They had no chance to say goodbye, no chance to save them. They trusted Anthony, a man who had been part of their family for decades, only for him to turn into their worst nightmare. In the weeks following the trial, Megan's devastated relatives spoke out, demanding that Anthony never be allowed any appeal, any sympathy, or any freedom. Anthony Todt now sits in a maximum security prison, isolated from the world, facing the weight of his crimes alone. He no longer controls the narrative. He no longer controls his family's future, because he stole it. He has no legacy other than that of a monster. The Todt family murders weren't just about one man's downfall. They were a sobering reminder of how manipulation, lies, and financial desperation can escalate into absolute devastation. This story isn't just about the justice system serving its duty. It's about the haunting question left behind. How do you ever see the warning signs? When the monster wears the mask of a loving father. If this case shook you to your core, subscribe to the channel, because crimes like these must never be forgotten.